April 14, 1912. The unsinkable ship is on her maiden voyage, on her way to New York City. The grandest ship of the time, everyone wanted to ride on the Titanic. The very rich, the very poor, and everyone in between. Gliding through the icy cold waters of the Atlantic, surrounded by icebergs on all sides, it was only a matter of time before disaster struck. And as we all know, disaster struck. Titanic hit an iceberg that night, and less than 3 hours later she sank beneath the waters of the Atlantic, and the rest is history. But many people don't know that the RMS Titanic has a connection with a city less than 20 miles north of Manhattan, a city that was allowed to vote to become the 6th borough of New York City, but ultimately the citizens of said city turned down that vote to become a borough. The city I speak of is Yonkers, New York, and this is the connection between Yonkers and the RMS Titanic. Enjoy. Alexander Robbins was born in Cornwall, England in 1862. He learned the trade of a stonemason and in 1880 married 16-year-old Charity Laurie, also a native of Cornwall. Mrs. Robbins gave birth to 10 children, only 2 of whom would survive past infancy. Anna, born 1885, and Alexander Jr., born 1890. The Robbinses first came to America in 1888. The family went back and forth between the United States and Cornwall at least once, as Alexander Robbins Jr. was born in the latter place. By 1900, the family had settled in Yonkers and was living at 24 Garfield Street in the Nodine Hill section of the city. In 1910, the Robbins household included Alexander and Charity, Alexander Jr. and his sister Anna, Anna's husband Patrick Curtin, and their 3 children, William, Gladys, and Howard. In August 1911, Alexander and Charity returned to the United Kingdom. They traveled across the Atlantic aboard the RMS Olympia, sister ship of the RMS Titanic, to stay with Mrs. Robbins' relatives in Cornwall. At the time of their departure, the couple may have intended to stay permanently in the United Kingdom. In fact, prior to leaving Yonkers, Mr. Robbins remarked to one of his friends that, quote, he did not think he would ever live to see America again, end quote. Although they had been away from their native country for many years, a large circle of friends met the couple upon their return to Cornwall. Later, however, the Robbinses changed their minds and decided to return to Yonkers. A man of genial disposition who made a host of new friends during his time in Cornwall, Mr. Robbins gave a great deal of thought to his return trip, as the Yonkers Herald reported. Quote, Mr. Robbins wrote his son that when he returns he wanted to come back on the gigantic Titanic on her maiden trip, and he added that an investigation convinced him that the service in the 3rd class on the magnificent liner was as good, almost as that of the 2nd, so he wrote that he would save $100 by traveling in the 3rd class, end quote. The Robbinses spent a little over £14 to purchase ticket 3337 for the voyage. While the Robbinses were the only Yonkers residents aboard the Titanic, another household in the city was awaiting relatives who were sailing aboard the ocean liner. Amandus Palmquist, a 30-year-old carpenter residing at 52 Buena Vista Avenue, was awaiting the arrival of his 26-year-old brother Oscar. Natives of Sweden, Amandus and Oscar were 2 of 9 children of Knut and Johanna Johannesson. Amandus came to the United States in 1896 and adopted the surname Palmquist, and his brother took the same action as he prepared to come to America. On April 16, the Yonkers Herald first told its readers of the sinking of the Titanic that had taken place in the early hours of the previous day. A headline blurring the words, quote, Yonkers couple aboard Titanic plunging in sea, end quote, alerted residents of the city to the fact that the Robbinses were aboard the doomed ship. Early reports of the Titanic disaster were followed by bits and pieces of information regarding the survivors. Many relatives and friends of the Titanic passengers traveled to the White Star Pier, which is Pier 59 at West 18th Street, to see what they could learn regarding the fates of their loved ones. No complete list of survivors were available, but officials at the pier were able to confirm that the RMS Carpathia, a ship that had spent the morning of April 15 picking up survivors of the disaster, was on its way to Manhattan with several hundred survivors and was scheduled to arrive on the night of April 18. On April 17, the New York Times printed a list of first and second class passengers who were known to have boarded Carpathia. The following morning, the Times published a more extensive list of passengers known to be aboard the Carpathia. This list did not contain the names of Oscar Palmquist or either of the Robinses. Alexander Robbins, Jr., told a reporter from the Yonkers Statesman that, quote, "The only thing left for him to do was to wait until the Carpathia reaches New York City," end quote. Anna Robin Curtin held out hope that at least one of her parents could have survived the sinking, as she mentioned during a discussion with the reporter from the Yonkers Herald. Quote, "Mrs. Curtin has not lost hope that she will yet hear that at least her mother was saved from the disaster. She refers with a ray of hope to the fact that all dispatches received, such as they are, refer to the fact that the rule of the sea under which women and children are given preference was strictly observed. Therefore," she stated, "her mother will probably be among the women who were rescued and who are on their way now to New York, where they are expected to arrive tomorrow night," end quote. The moment of truth for loved ones of the Titanic passengers came on the night of April 18, when Carpathia docked at Pier 54. Although they had not seen the names of their relatives on the survivors list, Patrick Curtin, Alexander Robbins Jr., and Amanda's Palmquist anxiously watched the passengers trudge down the gangplank. The prayers of one of the Yonkers men were answered when a very worn-out Oscar Palmquist made his way down Carpathia's gangplank. An overjoyed Amandus listened to his brother's incredible tale of survival. Oscar explained that during Titanic's final moments afloat, he tied 2 life belts around his waist and waited until only a few feet of the ship remained above water before plunging into the icy waters of the Atlantic. Knowing that the suction created by the sinking ship could pull him underwater, Oscar hurriedly swam away from the dying Titanic. He had made it about 100 yards from the ship when he heard an explosion, which caused a large stateroom door to land near him. Using the door as a life raft, Oscar paddled toward the nearest lifeboat, which was Lifeboat 15. Oscar was greeted with a sharp whack across his fingers from one of the boat's oars. The crew of the lifeboat refused to take on any more passengers as they feared that the craft might capsize. At this hopeless moment, Oscar heard a voice cry out to him in his native tongue. Peering through the darkness, he saw a young Swedish woman with whom he had conversed aboard the Titanic. She leaned over the edge of the lifeboat and handed Oscar one end of her shawl, which allowed him to float alongside the boat on his makeshift raft. By the time the lifeboat was rescued by the Carpathia, he realized the terrible price that had been paid for his survival. In lending her shawl to Oscar as a tether, the Swedish girl had suffered from exposure and died before Carpathia reached Lifeboat 15. The Yonkers Herald reported that, quote, "The fate of that poor girl has disturbed Oscar more than his own suffering, and that the doctors say that he may never fully recover from the experience," end quote. For Alexander Robbins Jr. and his brother-in-law Patrick Curtin, there would be no last-minute miracle. On the morning of April 20th, a letter arrived at 24 Garfield Street that served to compound the grief of the Robbins family. The letter was from Mary Ellen Nancaro and was addressed to her husband, William Henry Nancaro, care of Patrick and Anna Curtin. A resident of Cornwall, Mr. Nancaro was a first cousin of Charity Robbins, and after reading the letter, Anna Curtin concluded that Mr. Nancaro must have accompanied her parents aboard the Titanic and was presumably lost alongside the Robbinses. The Yonkers Herald reported on the contents of the letter, quote, "The letter of Mrs. Nancaro, which is dated April 11, is pitiable in the light of the disaster. One of the passages reads, 'I don't remember that I said farewell to you when you left, and I don't remember seeing Charity. Ask her if she came in to see me.' From the tone and contents of the letter, Mrs. Curtin believes that Mrs. Nancarrow must have been sick when the Yonkers people visited her. Mrs. Curtin fears the consequence of Mrs. Nancarrow learning of the sad death of her husband. Mrs. Nancarrow speaks of how hard her children took the departure of her husband. Mrs. Nancarrow wants to know what sort of passage her husband had, and she asks that Mrs. Robbins write without delay. End quote. Mr. Nancarrow, who had previously visited the United States, was apparently heading to Yonkers to seek employment as an engine driver. He was survived by his wife and 8 children. Shortly after learning of the loss of the Titanic, the White Star Line had chartered several ships to search the surface of the Atlantic for remains of those who had lost their lives in the sinking. The first of these, the Canadian cable ship Mackay Bennett, left Halifax, Nova Scotia on April 17 to examine the sea where the ship had gone down. During 7 days of work, the Mackay Bennett recovered 206 bodies, including the remains of both Alexander and Charity Robbins. The Mackay Bennett docked in Halifax on the morning of April 30th. White Star arranged for the remains of Mr. and Mrs. Robbins to be sent via rail to Yonkers, where they arrived in May. That same day, simple death notices for the couple appeared in the Yonkers Herald. Quote, Robbins, at sea, on April 15, 1912, Charity Robbins, wife of Alexander A. Robbins, age 47 years. Funeral from residence of her daughter, Mrs. Patrick Curtin, 24 Garfield Street, Sunday afternoon, 1:45 p.m. Services at St. John's Episcopal Church at 2:30 o'clock. Interment in Oakland Cemetery. End quote. Alexander's death notice was identical minus his death age. On May 6, a funeral procession left from the Curtin residence at 24 Garfield Street and made its way to St. John's Episcopal Church in Getty Square. The Yonkers Herald recounted that the 2 hearses made their way through, quote, a throng at the house and all along the route to the church, passing sidewalks lined with curious and the sympathizing, end quote. The hearses were followed by the Men of Columbia Lodge, Sons of St. George, an English fraternal organization of which Mr. Robbins was a member. A crowd of 2,000 filled the church and spilled out onto South Broadway. The Herald commented that, quote, the funeral will be remembered for years by all who had witnessed a tribute to the memory of the Yonkers dead of the world's greatest sea disaster, end quote. The Robbinses were the only couple who perished aboard the Titanic for whom both bodies were recovered. Their personal effects, including their jewelry and traveler's checks, were not returned to their children until August 9, 1912, after Alexander Robbins Jr. was appointed executor of his parents' estate. The body of William Henry Nancarrow, Mrs. Robbins' cousin, was never recovered. Oscar Palmquist eventually made his way to Bridgeport, Connecticut, where he worked as a toolmaker. Since his youth, Oscar had experienced problems with his knees, and he believed that the Titanic disaster had exacerbated his disability. Although the Red Cross gave him $200 in April 1912, the Swedish consulate in New York City denied his application for additional funds the following August. On March 23, 1925, Oscar drew his pay from his employer, the Connecticut Electric Company, and informed his landlady, quote, he was going out for a good time and didn't know when he would be back, end quote. Oscar never returned home, but just like they did 13 years earlier, members of his family held hope that their relative would be found alive. Unfortunately, on April 18, they were informed that Oscar's body had been discovered in a pond in Beardsley Park. Oscar's family believed that foul play was involved in his demise, as the undertaker who handled his remains told them that his lungs contained no water. The family felt that he could have been victim of a husband of a woman with whom he was having an affair. Anyone familiar with Oscar's past would likely believe the family's version over the official report, which stated that Oscar Palmquist who had claimed to survive history's most well-known maritime disaster by floating on a door for 5 hours, several hundred miles from land in the 13,000-foot deep Atlantic Ocean, died by accidentally drowning in a 6-foot deep pond.